This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. Happy New Year, everyone! I am personally very excited to see what 2023 will hold, especially for Agriculture Today programming. We're kicking off our first program of the year with an insightful conversation on African Swine Fever Virus with K-State livestock feed scientist Dr. Cassie Jones. She joins Agriculture Today intern Kady Figge for a two-part segment sharing why this virus can be challenging to combat and the latest research on it here at K-State. We end with the latest edition of Milk Lines from K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk. He shares that in the milk barn, maintaining teat health during extreme cold weather is a challenge. While we've already experienced a bit of that cold recently, Brouk shares ways to minimize teat damage in extreme cold that is still expected to continue in the winter months ahead. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today.
This is Agriculture Today. For Samantha Bennett, I'm Ag Today intern Kady Figge. Joining me in studio today is K-State professor in Animal Sciences and Industry, Dr. Cassie Jones. And today she will be speaking with us about African Swine Fever Virus. So thanks for joining us today.
It's my pleasure.
Before we jump into this conversation about this very large subject, can you tell us a little bit about what African Swine Fever Virus is?
Sure. So obviously, African swine fever virus is a virus that originated in Africa that affects swine. And so the name is actually pretty indicative in this case, but we'll talk a little more deeply about it. There's a lot of different viruses that circulate around the world. And, when I'm teaching students, I tend to refer to it as the armored tank of viruses. What that means from a scientific perspective is that it's a very large virus. It's an enveloped DNA type virus that survives for great long periods of time. And it's ultimately one that's evolved over the past decade or so as it's moved around the world and is ultimately causing a lot of devastation within the swine industry.
Wow, what a way to describe that. So how does this virus spread, and can humans get it?
Yeah, I always talk about ASF, or African swine fever, as a little bit of the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so the good thing about African swine fever virus is that humans cannot get it. It is a swine-only virus. The bad thing is that it has a high, but kind of a delayed case fatality, and so it's passed from one animal to the other, but it doesn't just kill all animals right away. It makes them sick, and so maybe a veterinarian goes into a farm and starts to investigate what's going on, and it takes a couple of weeks to recognize, oh, this is African swine fever virus. And over that time, there's a number of mortalities. But that also means that that person that was on that farm has likely gone to another farm. And so we believe that that's largely how it's spread. Certainly nose-to-nose contact, but also through something called fomites, which are kind of things that we can carry around diseases on, like the bottoms of our shoes. And that's where we run into the really ugly part of it, is that ultimately this disease is always fatal. There's no viable vaccine currently for it, and ultimately all animals are going to either be humanely euthanized or ultimately die from the disease.
Yeah, so along with that, how can our producers prevent infection from this?
There's a lot of things that we can be doing, and we're fortunate here in the United States that mainland North America has no active cases of African swine fever virus. It is close. It's as close as the island of Hispaniola or the Dominican Republic. And so really, as we look at the United States and our disease prevention efforts, most of ours are focused on how do we keep it from coming into the country at all. And so that means we're really paying close attention to products and items that are coming from those countries that do have the disease that are ultimately destined for pigs. And so we have a lot of current rules and regulations in place about the movement of live pigs from one country to another, certainly into the United States, which is a free country, or affected pork products.
Absolutely. So you mentioned a few places that have had this. So can you talk a little bit about the spread of it across the world?
Sure. That's one of the things with ASF that's been really interesting is that really the disease existed pretty much in Africa in the wild boar population for a period of time. And while it was stable, it wasn't really moving that quickly. But as soon as we started to see it enter kind of this like European, Asia area in 2007, we became concerned because at that point we started to see it being tracked by European wild boar populations. And then at that point throughout Europe have had a number of different cases where commercial swine or domesticated swine become infected because of that interaction with wild boar in those regions. But what was the biggest awakening for all of us was when China ultimately became contaminated in August of 2018. So in August of 2018, when China announced that they had broken with African swine fever virus, that was very concerning to us as a global community. First, because China has so many people and they depend heavily on pork that this became a humanitarian crisis. But then likewise, because of the way that the Chinese people manage pigs, we've been able to learn a lot of lessons as this disease has spread throughout China and really throughout all of Southeast Asia at this point. But the bad news is that they've really struggled to contain it. And so even though they have some of the most sophisticated science and management practices in the world, it continues to devastate their industry. And so for us, as we're looking in at that from our side in North America, we're trying to understand how it's spreading and how to prevent that ultimately from entering the United States.
Absolutely. So my next question is going to be kind of a loaded question. But what are some of the impacts that this virus has had environmentally, socially, and economically?
Oh, that is a deep question. Yeah, there's a lot of different pieces to it. You know, maybe for me, the most telling is when ASF entered the island of Hispaniola. And so initially, it was found in the Dominican Republic. And what is concerning about its arrival in the Dominican Republic is that by the point that we had diagnosed it, it had spread to 11 different provinces within that country. And so that's one of the concerning pieces, is that in the time that it took to recognize the symptoms, identify it as this terrible disease, ultimately it had already spread across that island. And it had also extended to Haiti. And again, that's where, from the humanitarian perspective, when we talk about economic destruction and social concerns, we're talking about people that have really developed a social standing and a flavor and taste for pork. Whereas a lot of us in the United States have a high reliance on beef and chicken and pork as part of that balanced diet of different meats. Really, a lot of the other countries, Southeast Asia and especially Hispaniola, are very reliant on pork. And so when the price of pork and the availability of pork becomes limited, that really starts to limit their calorie options as a people and ultimately their potential protein options. And so that's really impactful from a social perspective. It also puts in some constraints, obviously economically, on those countries as they're trying to manage these humanitarian crises and manage to get everybody fed. But then maybe what's more interesting to layer on top of that are all the politics and trade components that come with it. As we think about what countries' policies and, you know, what we're accepting across this border relative to that one and potential retaliatory reactions or versus aid components, that's a piece that as we look at this from a broader community, certainly is something that we have to be sensitive to, that as we look at, you know, the things that directly impact our pork producers in the United States, our ability to export pork is very important. I mean, I'm a beef producer, and so even as a beef producer, I'm one that understands if we lose the price of pork because of pork export markets, that's directly going to impact my home base and the price of beef and the availability of that product as well. And so all of these different components are interrelated. So yeah, it was a big question. I don't know if I did it any justice at all, Kady, but I'm happy to discuss that one more if you'd like.
No, absolutely. And I think it makes such a big impact because of what you have to do if animals get African swine fever virus. Could you talk a little bit about, you know, if a producer finds this, what's the repercussions of that?
Yeah, that's a great point, is that, you know, I really see kind of two distinct scenarios that for us here in the United States. You know, in a good scenario for us domestically, we continue to keep ASF out. And in that case, you know, as we've seen, as soon as it enters a country, we have not successfully eradicated it in any of the countries that it's recently been populated in. And so that drives up U.S. prices on pork, but also those other proteins. But what happens when, right? And so if ASF enters the United States, we would expect all of our export partners to stop accepting the pork from our borders because of concerns with African swine fever virus. Now, we're hoping that would be short-lived and likely temporary, but pretty problematic when you're talking about a protein like pork, where somewhere between 25 to 35% of all of the domestic product that's produced is exported. And so we're talking about a lot of protein that starts to flood the American markets. We would also then see, some quick sell-off of pigs, some dramatic price drops. But realistically, what's happening at the producer level, those are even some uglier things. If ASF is identified on a farm, realistically, we can expect that state animal health officials and USDA are going to draw a circle around that farm, and any porcine animal, any pig or pig-related species within that circle is going to be humanely euthanized. And that might seem extreme, but ultimately, as a scientist, it is the best way and hopefully the best option, if we have to utilize it, to prevent further disease spread. And so as we look at options and practice exercises with USDA in different states, as we go through those scenarios, having control of pork and pork movement and the movement of live pigs becomes important. And so we would expect it to be immediately devastating, both to the producers that have pigs that are positive on their farms, but also to the rest of the pork industry and really ultimately animal agriculture as it relates to the economics of all of our products and their availability.
Well, it's certainly good to know that the United States Department of Agriculture and all the people involved in that are practicing ways to be able to combat the issue if it does come into the United States, for sure. And what's a way that our listeners can find more information, maybe read some articles, get more knowledge out of this?
All of our extension publications, popular press articles, and most updated research can be found on our website, which is ksufeed.org.
That's awesome. And as always, listeners, the links to that information can be found in the show notes of today's program, which can be found on agtoday.net. Thank you so much for joining us in the studio today to talk about African swine fever virus.
It's been my pleasure, Katie.
So once again, that was K-State Professor in Animal Sciences and Industry, Dr. Cassie Jones, with insight on African swine fever virus. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. For Samantha Bennett, I'm Ag Today intern Kady Figge. Joining me in studio today is K-State Professor in Animal Sciences and Industry, Dr. Cassie Jones. And today she'll be speaking with us about African Swine Fever Virus. So thanks for joining us today.
It's my pleasure.
I know that you are part of a team at K-State that studies and works to combat this large virus. Could you tell us a little bit about your team and your work within that?
Yeah, I'm fortunate at K-State because we just have a lot of really great people that care passionately about science and about producers. And in this case, we have a group of individuals that are part of our feed safety research team. And so it's myself, Jason Woodworth from Animal Science, Chad Polk from Grain Science, and Jordan Gebhardt from the Veterinary School. And collectively, we kind of all bring our own expertise to the table as a way of trying to understand how to prevent entry of African swine fever virus in the case of feed or ingredients. So, for example, we've demonstrated and it's been shown that some viruses that are really stable but affect pigs, something like Seneca virus A or Seneca Valley virus, you may have heard of that one, that's been demonstrated to enter a country and cause disease through feed or ingredients. And so we don't want that to happen from, an ingredient that we import from an ASF positive country. But at the same time, it's not practical for us to just stop all imports of all ingredients from any country that's ASF positive because we would have very few trade partners at this point. And so a lot of our research is focused on how do we prevent and really focus on what are the biggest elephants in the room, right? And so what are the biggest things that we need to be focusing on in terms of specific categories of ingredients that are considered to be high risk? And then how can we mitigate that risk? So that how can we prevent that from entering the United States in the first place? But also we are doing quite a bit of preventative work as well ourselves that if it were to enter, how do we make sure that it isn't accidentally spread throughout the feed supply? Because what we often see is that farms in the United States have pretty strong biosecurity. It's not very likely, Kady, that you can go from, one sow farm and go to another in the same day without showering and taking some pretty extreme steps for disease prevention. That's not the case with feed currently. We might deliver to a farm, take that same feed truck back to the feed mill, and go to a different farm, regardless of what that disease status is of those different farms. And so that's something that we're really working on, and it's an area called feed biosecurity.
Okay, so with your team members on this research team, how do you even decide what to research based on African swine fever virus?
Well, in the world of ASF, it's actually pretty exciting because there's so much we don't know. So as a scientist, right, there's a whole new world out there of new information that's out there to be found. It's also frustrating at times because there's no standard way to conduct that research. So it's a little bit of fun and exciting. My students tend to call themselves kind of the scientific MacGyvers of sorts because many times we're kind of figuring things out along the way on how to conduct that research initially. But we really look first from kind of what do we learn and what are some lessons in the field. A lot of our most important things that we've researched in the past are things that we learned work or maybe don't work as effectively from our partners in Southeast Asia. So, for example, we have a pork production system in Vietnam that we work with routinely. And they're a really sophisticated production system, very Western type of management practices. And at the same time, they're in the middle of the most pig-dense region of Vietnam and have been riddled with African swine fever virus. And so as we help them identify, how do new sites break? How are some sites that have not broken with the disease still surviving? And kind of what are the characteristics of what leads to sites being more likely to have disease than others? That's really helped us identify good research questions that we can then bring back to the United States and research here in Manhattan under controlled conditions. So we do research kind of a little bit of both sides. We see that field research in Vietnam, and then we bring it back into Manhattan in controlled conditions and can do controlled, very isolated research that really looks at big questions in a much more precise manner.
And I'm sure you get the opportunity to use some unique materials to do all of that.
Yeah, so we're fortunate here at K-State. We have some great facilities. A lot of our work is done at the Feed Safety Research Center, in the O.H. Cruz Feed Technology Innovation Center. Many of our projects have been through something like the Biosecurity Research Institute or the BRI. But yeah, a lot of our work happens to be with feed or feed-associated items. And so probably one of the more I don't know if it was hilarious or funny projects that we've worked on is we actually purchased some salvaged truck cabs. And because in Vietnam, one of the main ways that we were seeing virus spread from one farm to another was not necessarily through the ingredients, but through the delivery trucks, the feed delivery trucks and the drivers that were getting out at one farm and then going to deliver feed at a different farm. And so we bought some salvaged truck cabs and brought them into this controlled laboratory environment and contaminated them on purpose and then evaluated a lot of different ways to see if we can get rid of that contamination in varying levels of practicality, right? We all want to do something that would be as practical as possible, but at the same point, we want that virus to be destroyed. And so, we did things as low and as minimal as just kind of having overnight downtime of the truck cab to spraying the inside with kind of a garden sprayer that had some different types of sanitizers to the point of putting kind of fancy machines inside that would fully decontaminate the inside of all of those cabs so that we can really make some better recommendations so that if this is a situation that affects us in the future, we have more scientific-based examples and true references for recommendations in the future.
Sounds like you guys have a lot of fun in the lab. So, but taking a step back with your team, what's kind of the 20,000-foot view of what you're researching?
Yeah, again, as we look kind of broadly, we try to look at the spread of African swine fever virus during feed manufacturing, the survival of it in feed or ingredients over time, and then what we can do about that. And so we've looked at, how much virus does it take to actually make a pig sick? Because similar to kind of cold and flu season, right, you may be exposed to, a kindergartner that has the sniffles and you may not get sick, but your great aunt might. And so we all have kind of different immune systems and some of those are more sensitive than others. And so likewise, we're trying trying to understand what are factors that impact how much dose it takes to cause true disease within an animal. And then likewise, what are things we can do to dilute that dose, right? So that if we have the disease within the United States, what are some things that we can do to try to make it so that that terrible virus doesn't spread to others? And some of the things that we figured out along the way, there are some feed additives that we can add into the ingredients that prevent some contamination and actually could treat some contamination if they were contaminated in the first place. We also look at things like thermal processing or pelleting and, what are some sanitation procedures that if this made its way into a feed mill, how could we clean that out? And so collectively kind of looking at it from the manufacturing perspective, the production perspective, even the transportation side, what are some of the practical things we can do? But again, most of the time what that means in a virus like African Swine Fever Virus or these other swine viruses is that we're doing this type of research in a controlled setting, and we're doing it in biohazard suits, right, with very elaborate and intricate equipment. But we're asking pretty practical questions and using some pretty practical things like salvage truck cabs.
Incredible work. So, on a personal note, for you individually, why African Swine Fever Virus? What made you want to study this and combat this major issue?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, too. So I try to do what I think the producers of Kansas need me to do, right? And so as someone who works at a university and cares passionately about the future of animal agriculture and ultimately, for the pork producers within the state, I try to zoom out a little bit and say, what are the most important things that I can do to help those producers? And they actually tell us this either directly through conversations or in many cases through different surveys that like Kansas Department of Ag and different components do. Routinely, they tell us they expect that Kansas State University helps them find and produce great talent. And so I'm passionate about that. And I've had you, Kady, in the classroom. And so I love the teaching side. But on the other side, foreign animal disease prevention is a big aspect that they would like us to be working on. And so we continue to do research in African swine fever virus and in kind of virus transmission more broadly, because that's what pork producers are telling us are things that they believe that we should be doing as a land-grant institution.
Absolutely. Certainly inspiring. So if you happen to have inspired some of our listeners today, whether that's students or adults or anybody, what's your best advice if they want to get involved in something like this?
Well, we're always looking for more members of our team, whether that's, from a producer standpoint. We do a lot of producer education, but also a lot of research on farms. And so if you'd like us to come in and look at biosecurity assessments, help identify where there might be gaps on your own farm or within your production system, we do that routinely. Also, if you're interested more specifically in kind of what do we do here at K-State, our website is ksufeed.org, and you're welcome to always reach out to me. Email's probably the easiest, which is jonesc@ksu.edu, but I'm also always happy here to pick up the phone and chat or visit with someone if they come on campus or would like me to come out to their farm.
That's awesome. And as always, listeners, the links to that information can be found in the show notes of today's program, which can be found on agtoday.net. Thank you so much for joining us in the studio today to talk about African Swine Fever Virus.
It's been my pleasure, Kady.
So once again, that was K-State Professor in Animal Sciences and Industry, Dr. Cassie Jones, with insight on African Swine Fever Virus. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. In the milk barn, one of the biggest challenges during extreme cold weather is teat health. In cold weather, pre- and post-dips can remove naturally occurring oils and expose wet teat tissue to frigid temperatures. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk has information for maintaining teat health in both dairy cows and calves during extreme cold.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning some tips that we might want to consider as we approach winter, and especially the very cold temperatures as we go below zero here in the next few weeks. So as we think about wintertime on our dairy farms, one of the primary things we need to think about is the health of the teat ends on our cows. One of the best ways to keep those teat ends healthy during the winter months is to make sure that we're using post dips that do not freeze. And as you think about colder temperatures and wind chills, you need to take this into consideration. When wind chills drop below the 0 mark, and we could see wind chill temperatures that drop to minus 10, minus 20, minus 30, maybe even minus 40 possibly this winter, we need to make sure that we have a winter dip that does not freeze under those conditions. Many winter dips are great as long as we're not down to those extreme temperatures. During the extreme wind chill, it might be a good idea to consider a couple of things. Number one, you may not want to post dip for a day or two. If it's just going to be a short-lived event, it might be better for the health of the teat ends not to put on a post dip that might freeze in those sorts of conditions. Number two, you can use a dry type dip, a powder, and sometimes that is an alternate thing that we can do that would be very healthy for the cows as well and provide some protection from bacteria as they go out and lay down in their stalls. Another thing that you could consider doing is allowing the cows to stand in the parlor for a few minutes to allow that post-dip to drip off before they walk outside. Also blotting the teat ends with a paper towel is another method of trying to prevent those droplets that form on the end of the teats from freezing as they exit the barn. Now, as they exit the barn, if they're exposed to wind, stacking straw bales, or providing some other type of windbreak as they exit and head back to their pens is an excellent idea as well to reduce the chance that we might see some frozen teat ends. Again, frozen teat ends are very difficult to heal, as you well know, and when we think about somatic cell count, this will add to our somatic cell count during the winter time. So aside from that, the other group of animals on our farm that tend to often really suffer under the cold is our calves. Keep in mind that the calves have a greater need for energy when it's cold, and again, they start becoming cold stressed when the temperature drops below about 30 degrees Fahrenheit. So for each 10 degrees that we drop below 30 degrees, their increase in energy is about 10%. So when we go down to 0, that's a 30% increase in energy needs for them. So if you're not on an accelerated growth program, feeding an extra feeding maybe over the noon hour is an excellent way to get energy into those animals during the coldest weather that we might experience. It'll also help keep them healthier. If you're already on an accelerated growth program where you're feeding extra milk every day anyway, it's probably not as necessary, but again, a partial feeding midday could be helpful to those animals as well, as they have the same increase in energy needs as what those that are on a conventional program would have. Making sure that we keep water in front of the calves is also important. I know during freezing weather it's really hard to keep that water from freezing, but offering water in the morning and then again in the afternoon or early evening is a very excellent thing to do, realizing that we may have to break ice both times to make sure that we have some water available to our calves. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to consider some special things for lactating dairy cows as well as calves during the coldest spells of winter that we have.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.